The first gunshot came at dawn, just as Vivian Dubois stepped from the stagecoach onto the dusty streets of Copper Ridge. Her burgundy traveling dress was wrinkled from the 3-day journey, but her posture remained impeccably straight as if the spine beneath her corset were carved from the same steel as her determination. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory was still a place where fortunes could be made and reputations destroyed with equal speed. Vivian had come with precious little of the former and too much of the latter. "Miss, you might want to step back," the driver called down as another shot rang out from the saloon. "Seems like a typical Tuesday morning in Copper Ridge." Vivian merely nodded, her green eyes taking in everything: the weathered buildings, the muddy street churned by wagon wheels and horse hooves, and the curious stares already being cast her way from the women sweeping their porches. Her arrival hadn't gone unnoticed, despite the early hour and the commotion. "Is there a hotel where I might find lodging?" she asked, her voice carrying the slight polish of an Eastern education, something that immediately marked her as an outsider. The stagecoach driver pointed toward a 2-story building with a fresh coat of white paint. "The Silver Dollar. Tell Mrs. Hayes that Tom sent you." Vivian thanked him and gathered her 2 valises. They held everything she owned in the world now. The rest had been sold to pay her father's debts and secure her passage west. She'd come to Copper Ridge because of a letter of promise from her late father's business partner that she would find employment teaching at the town's newly established school. What the letter hadn't mentioned was that Copper Ridge appeared to settle its disagreements with gunfire before breakfast. As she made her way toward the hotel, the batwing doors of the saloon burst open. A man stumbled out, holding his bleeding arm, followed by another who holstered his pistol with a practiced movement. The second man was tall, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but even from a distance, Vivian could see the authority in his stance. "Next time, pay your debts, Collins," the man said, his voice carrying across the street. Vivian quickened her pace, hoping to avoid any further violence, but the man in the hat had already noticed her. She felt his gaze tracking her movement, heavy as a physical touch. When she reached the hotel steps, she risked a glance back. The man had crossed the street and was now close enough for her to see his features: a strong jawline darkened with stubble, eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea, and a mouth that seemed perpetually set in an unreadable line. "You're new," he stated simply, tipping his hat. "Welcome to Copper Ridge, madam." Before she could respond, the door to the hotel opened, and an older woman with silver-streaked hair emerged. "Yates Mitchell, are you shooting people before I've even had my coffee again?" The woman asked, hands on her hips. The man, Yates, shrugged. "Just a disagreement over cards, Mrs. Hayes, nothing that required the undertaker." The woman snorted, then turned her attention to Vivian. "You must be our new schoolteacher. We've been expecting you." "Yes, I'm Vivian Dubois," she confirmed, extending her hand. Mrs. Hayes took it warmly. "Well, come in, dear. You look like you could use some breakfast and a proper bath after that journey." As Mrs. Hayes ushered her inside, Vivian was acutely aware of Yates Mitchell's continued observation. There was something unsettling about the intensity of his gaze, not threatening, exactly, but as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. "Don't mind the sheriff," Mrs. Hayes whispered as they entered the hotel lobby. "He's rough around the edges, but he's kept this town as civilized as possible, considering." "He's the sheriff?" Vivian asked, surprised. The man had seemed more outlaw than lawman to her. "For 3 years now, cleaned up Copper Ridge considerably, though that's not saying much." Mrs. Hayes guided her toward a desk. "Now, let's get you settled. The school term doesn't start for another week, so you'll have time to acquaint yourself with our little community." What Mrs. Hayes didn't say, what Vivian would soon discover, was that Copper Ridge had already begun forming opinions about her. By noon, the whispers had started. Within 3 days of her arrival in Copper Ridge, Vivian realized her reputation had preceded her. The letter from her father's business partner, Mr. Holloway, had contained a teaching position, but had omitted crucial information, namely that he had spread word of her father's disgrace and subsequent suicide back east. The women of the town watched her with wary eyes as she walked to the schoolhouse each morning to prepare for the upcoming term. Their whispers followed her like shadows. They say her father embezzled funds from his own bank before taking the coward's way out, she overheard Mrs. Peterson tell Mrs. Wilson at the general store, and now she's come here to teach our children? A woman with such a heritage, Mrs. Wilson had replied, not bothering to lower her voice. Vivian had kept her head high, selecting the pencils and paper she needed for her classroom with steady hands that betrayed none of the humiliation burning within her. The truth was more complicated. Her father had been framed by his partners, including Mr. Holloway, who had then offered her this position out of what he called charity, but what she recognized as guilt. She had taken it because she had nowhere else to go, but she had come with a purpose to clear her father's name by finding evidence of the partner's fraud. Evidence she believed might be in Holloway's office here in Copper Ridge, where he had expanded his banking interests. On her 5th day in town, Vivian was arranging books on the shelves of the one-room schoolhouse when the door opened. Sheriff Yates Mitchell stood in the doorway, his tall frame blocking the light. "Miss Dubois," he said, removing his hat. "Thought I'd check in, see if you have everything you need for the term." Vivian straightened, brushing dust from her simple blue dress. "That's very considerate, Sheriff, but I believe everything is in order." He stepped inside, looking around the modest schoolhouse with its rows of benches and the blackboard she had meticulously cleaned. "Must be quite a change from back east." "Change can be refreshing," she replied carefully. "So can honesty," he countered, his gray eyes finding hers. "I received a telegram from Boston yesterday. Seems like there's more to your story than being a schoolteacher." Vivian's heart pounded, but her expression remained composed. "My past is my own concern, Sheriff, not when it might affect this town. Copper Ridge has had its share of people running from something." He moved closer, his steps slow and measured. "I'd prefer to know what I'm dealing with. I'm not a criminal, if that's what you're implying. Didn't say you were." He picked up one of the books she had been shelving, a collection of Shakespeare's works. "But people talk, Miss Dubois, and they're talking about you." "Let them," she said, lifting her chin. "I've done nothing wrong." Yates studied her for a long moment. Something in his expression shifted, a softening around the eyes that hadn't been there before. "No, I don't believe you have, but Copper Ridge can be unforgiving to those with secrets." "I've found that to be true of most places," she replied. He returned the book to the shelf, his fingers lingering on its spine. "Sunday's church service. You'll be expected to attend as the teacher. I'm aware of my responsibilities." "Good." He placed his hat back on his head. "Because every eye in town will be watching how you conduct yourself." Fair or not, that's the reality. As he turned to leave, Vivian called after him. "Sheriff," he paused at the door. "Why did you really come here today? It wasn't to check on school supplies." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Maybe I wanted to form my own opinion about the woman everyone's whispering about." "And have you?" "Still working on it, Miss Dubois." With that, he was gone, leaving her with more questions than answers about the enigmatic lawman. Sunday arrived clear and bright, the September air crisp with the promise of autumn. Vivian dressed with care in her best dress, a deep green that brought out her eyes and complemented her chestnut hair, which she had arranged in a simple but elegant knot at the nape of her neck. She was aware of the significance of this day. Her first public appearance at church would set the tone for her reception in the community. As she walked the short distance from the hotel to the white clapboard church, she felt the weight of unseen gazes from windows and porches. The church was nearly full when she arrived. Conversations hushed momentarily as she entered, then resumed with increased intensity. Vivian spotted an empty space in the back pew and moved toward it with dignified steps. She had just seated herself when a large, rough hand appeared in her field of vision. She looked up to find Sheriff Mitchell standing in the aisle beside her. "Miss Dubois," he said, loud enough for nearby congregants to hear, "would you do me the honor of sitting with me?" A collective intake of breath from the women nearby made it clear this was no ordinary gesture. The sheriff was offering her public recognition acceptance before the entire town. Without waiting for her answer, he extended his hand palm up. After a brief hesitation, she placed her gloved hand in his. What happened next would be the talk of Copper Ridge for weeks to come. Instead of simply leading her to his pew, Sheriff Yates Mitchell raised her hand to his lips and placed a deliberate kiss on her knuckles. The gesture was both courtly and defiant, a clear message to everyone watching that he held her in esteem. It was the kind of public declaration that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. "Thank you, Sheriff," Vivian said, finding her voice despite her surprise. He guided her to a pew near the front, aware of the fluttering whispers that spread through the congregation like wildfire. By taking her side so publicly, he had effectively challenged the town's judgment of her. As the service began, Vivian was acutely conscious of his solid presence beside her, the faint scent of leather and soap, the careful distance he maintained that was respectful yet clearly protective. What she couldn't understand was why this man, who barely knew her, would risk his standing in the community for her sake. After the service, they walked together down the church steps. In the bright sunlight, the contrast between them was even more apparent. She in her refined Eastern clothes, he in his practical Western attire, with a star pinned to his vest and a gun at his hip. "You've caused quite a stir, Sheriff," she murmured as they reached the bottom step. "Guess I have," he agreed, seeming unconcerned by the stares following them. "May I ask why?" He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Because I've seen how this town can tear someone down before giving them a fair chance. And because I received another telegram yesterday from a friend in the Boston Police Department who confirmed what I suspected." Vivian tensed. "Which is that your father was most likely innocent, and that certain business associates benefited considerably from his demise." His voice was low, meant only for her ears. "Including one Henry Holloway, who now owns the bank here in Copper Ridge." Her eyes widened. "You know about Holloway? I make it my business to know who holds power in my town," he said, "and I'm beginning to understand why you really came here." Before she could respond, Mrs. Peterson approached, her pinched face attempting a smile. "Miss Dubois, I was hoping you might join the ladies' auxiliary this week. We sew blankets for the less fortunate." The invitation was clearly a result of the sheriff's public endorsement. Vivian smiled politely. "That's very kind, Mrs. Peterson. I would be delighted." After Mrs. Peterson walked away, Yates offered his arm. "Allow me to walk you back to the hotel, Miss Dubois." As they strolled down the main street, observed by curious townspeople, Vivian spoke quietly. "You've altered my standing in this town with one gesture, Sheriff Mitchell." "Yates," he corrected, "and sometimes justice needs a little help." Their eyes met in a moment of understanding. In that instant, Vivian realized she had found an unexpected ally in her quest for truth, and perhaps something more complicated than she had bargained for. The following weeks brought dramatic changes to Vivian's life in Copper Ridge. The school term began, and she found herself genuinely enjoying the challenge of teaching the town's 23 children of various ages and backgrounds. The parents who had been so suspicious now greeted her with cautious acceptance, thanks largely to Sheriff Mitchell's continued public support. Each morning, he would tip his hat to her as she walked to the schoolhouse. Occasionally, he would stop by during lunch to check on her visits that never failed to set the children whispering and giggling behind their hands. Vivian knew these attentions were not merely for show. In the evenings, they would often meet in his office to discuss her father's case. Yates had been gathering information discreetly, leveraging his contacts in law enforcement across the territory and back east. "Holloway has been moving money through several banks," Yates explained one evening as they reviewed financial documents he had obtained. "Always small enough amounts to avoid suspicion, but they add up." Vivian leaned over the papers spread across his desk, the lamp casting a warm glow over them both. "This matches the pattern I suspected from my father's ledgers, but we need proof of the original fraud, the one they framed him for." Yates nodded, his face close to hers as they studied the numbers. "Holloway keeps his personal records in a safe in his office. Getting access won't be easy." "I could speak with him directly, confront him with what we know," Vivian suggested. Yates's hand covered hers, his touch firm and warm. "That would be dangerous. Holloway has too much to lose." "He wouldn't hesitate to silence you." The concern in his voice touched something deep within her. Over these weeks of working together, their relationship had evolved from reluctant allies to something neither of them had acknowledged aloud. "Then, what do you suggest?" she asked, acutely aware of his hand still covering hers. "The bank's annual investors' meeting is next week. Holloway will be occupied for hours." Yates's eyes held hers steadily. "It would be the perfect time for someone to access his office, someone who wouldn't attract suspicion if seen entering the bank." "You're suggesting I break into his safe?" Vivian's eyes widened. "I'm suggesting we find evidence the legal way. As sheriff, I can request access to certain records if I have reasonable suspicion of financial impropriety." A smile touched his lips. "But I might need assistance from someone who understands banking documents." Their plan was formed that night, a daring scheme that would either vindicate her father's memory or potentially destroy what remaining reputation she had in Copper Ridge. As she prepared to leave, Yates walked her to the door of his office. The street outside was quiet, the town mostly asleep except for the distant piano music from the saloon. "Be careful, Vivian," he said softly, using her given name for the first time. "Holloway has friends in this town, powerful ones who wouldn't want this scandal exposed." "I've already lost everything once," she replied. "I'm not afraid to risk what little I have left for the truth." His hand came up to touch her cheek, a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. "You haven't lost everything, and you're not alone anymore." The moment hung between them, charged with unspoken feelings. Then, with surprising gentleness for a man of his size and reputation, Yates leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief but unmistakably tender, a promise of something neither of them had expected to find in this dusty frontier town. When he pulled away, his eyes searched hers. "I shouldn't have done that." "No," she agreed, her voice barely audible, "but I'm glad you did." With those words hanging in the air between them, she stepped into the night, her mind racing with thoughts of both justice and the unexpected turn her heart had taken. The day of the investors' meeting dawned bright and clear. Vivian dismissed her students at noon, citing a headache, a rare occurrence that raised no suspicions given her dedication to her teaching duties. She changed into a simple blue dress that wouldn't attract attention and made her way to the bank. The plan was straightforward. Yates would enter first, requesting a meeting with Holloway regarding some town business. While they spoke in the main conference room where the investors were gathered, Vivian would slip into Holloway's office using the key Yates had borrowed from the bank janitor the previous day. Her heart pounded as she approached the bank's side entrance. She had timed her arrival precisely 30 minutes after the meeting began, when everyone would be deep in discussion. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and she slipped inside, finding herself in a narrow hallway that led past the teller's counters to the private offices beyond. Holloway's was at the end, a large corner room with windows overlooking both the main street and the side alley. Once inside his office, she moved quickly to the painting behind his desk, a landscape of the Boston Harbor that seemed deliberately chosen to remind visitors of his Eastern connections. Behind it, just as Yates had predicted, was a wall safe. Vivian's hands trembled slightly as she began to work the dial. Her father had taught her the basics of safe cracking years ago, a skill he'd learned during his banking career for emergencies when locks malfunctioned. She had never imagined using this knowledge for such a purpose. After several tense minutes, she heard the satisfying click of the tumblers falling into place. Inside the safe were several leather-bound ledgers and a stack of correspondence. She took only what she needed, the most recent ledger and a bundle of letters tied with string that bore her father's name. Just as she was closing the safe, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic seized her as she quickly replaced the painting and looked for somewhere to hide. The office had no closet, and the desk was too small to conceal her. The door opened, and Vivian froze, clutching the documents to her chest. "What the hell are you doing?" Holloway demanded, his face flushing with anger. He was a portly man in his 50s, with thinning hair and cold eyes that now blazed with fury. "Mr. Holloway," she began, her mind racing for an explanation. He closed the door behind him, his gaze dropping to the papers in her hands. You're just like your father thinking you can take what isn't yours. These prove your fraud, she countered, finding courage in desperation. The money you stole, the lies you told about my father. Holloway's laugh was ugly. And who will believe you, a disgraced woman with no standing? He moved toward her menacingly. Give me those papers, Miss Dubois. No, she backed away, bumping into his desk. People will believe the evidence. There won't be any evidence, he said, reaching inside his jacket and withdrawing a small pistol. It's unfortunate, really. The stress of your father's disgrace finally became too much. Such a tragedy for the schoolteacher to take her own life. Vivian's blood turned cold. You won't get away with this. I already have, Holloway replied, raising the gun. The door burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Sheriff Mitchell stood in the doorway, his own weapon drawn and pointed steadily at Holloway. Drop it, Holloway, Yates commanded, his voice like steel. For a moment, it seemed Holloway might refuse. His hand tightened on his pistol. Don't, Yates warned. You're already facing fraud charges. Don't add murder to the list. After an agonizing moment, Holloway lowered his weapon and placed it on the desk. This proves nothing, he spat, her word against mine. Actually, came another voice from the doorway, it's her word, plus these telegrams from the Boston authorities, plus my own sworn statement about witnessing your attempted murder just now. Mayor Thompson stepped into the room, followed by 2 members of the town council. We heard everything, Henry. Vivian released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Yates moved to her side, his free hand touching her arm briefly in reassurance while keeping his gun trained on Holloway. You planned this, Holloway said, comprehension dawning on his face. We suspected you might react violently if confronted with evidence of your crimes, Yates replied evenly. Seems we were right. Within minutes, Holloway was in handcuffs, being led down the main street to the jail as townsfolk gathered to watch the spectacle. Vivian walked beside Yates, the ledger and letters still clutched in her hands, proof at last of her father's innocence. As they reached the jailhouse, Yates turned to her. It's over, he said quietly. Your father's name will be cleared. Tears filled her eyes, not of sadness, but of profound relief. Thank you, she whispered. His hand found hers, strong fingers intertwining with hers in full view of the gathering crowd. No need for thanks between partners. The word hung in the air between them, partners, with all its possible meanings. The aftermath of Holloway's arrest transformed Vivian's standing in Copper Ridge. The same women who had whispered her name like a sin now sought her company, eager to be associated with the schoolteacher who had helped expose a dangerous criminal. 2 weeks after Holloway was transported to Helena to await trial, Vivian received a telegram from Boston. The charges against her late father had been officially dismissed, and restitution from Holloway's seized assets would be forthcoming. Her family name was cleared. That evening, she found Yates waiting on the hotel porch, hat in hands. I heard about the telegram, he said as she approached. Congratulations. Thank you, she smiled, noticing how he seemed uncharacteristically nervous. Is something wrong? Not wrong, exactly. He cleared his throat. I was wondering if you'd join me for dinner tonight, not at the hotel restaurant, but at my place. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage a decent steak. The invitation surprised her. In all their time working together, through their growing closeness and even that one brief kiss, they had never stepped fully into the personal realm. I'd like that, she replied softly. His cabin sat on the edge of town, a sturdy structure he had built himself when he first became sheriff. Inside was simpler than she had expected, clean and orderly, with a few touches that spoke of the man. Books lined on roughly made shelves, a comfortable chair positioned by the hearth, a guitar leaning in one corner. It's not much, he said, watching her take it all in. It's perfect, she replied honestly. It suits you. They ate by lamplight, the conversation flowing easily between them. Yates told her of his life before becoming sheriff, his years riding with a cattle outfit, a brief stint as an army scout, the loss of his parents to influenza when he was just 20. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Boston, her father's devotion to her education, her dreams of someday opening her own school. And now, he asked, refilling her coffee cup, With your name cleared and restitution coming, you could return east if you wanted. The question held more than idle curiosity. Vivian could hear the uncertainty beneath his words. I've been thinking about that, she admitted. There's nothing for me in Boston now, my life is here. In Copper Ridge, he asked, his eyes intent on hers. Yes, I've grown to love teaching here. She paused, gathering her courage. And there are other reasons I'd like to stay. Yates set down his coffee cup and moved around the table until he was standing beside her chair. He offered his hand, and when she took it, he pulled her gently to her feet. What reasons might those be? He asked, his voice low. Instead of answering with words, Vivian stood on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his. Unlike their first kiss, this one deepened immediately, his arms encircling her waist as hers wound around his neck. When they finally parted, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. I need you to be sure, Vivian, life with a lawman isn't easy. There are dangers. She placed a finger over his lips. I'm not afraid of danger. I'm afraid of regrets. And my greatest regret would be walking away from you without seeing where it might lead. His smile transformed his face, softening the hard edges that his life had carved into him. I've been falling in love with you since the day you arrived on that stage, he confessed. Even before I knew your story, there was something about you, your strength, your dignity despite everything you'd been through. And I've been fighting my feelings for the gruff sheriff who kissed my hand in public and changed my life, she replied, her eyes shining. That night marked the beginning of their courtship, one conducted in full view of the town that had once judged her so harshly. Each Sunday, Sheriff Mitchell would escort Miss Dubois to church, and each time he would kiss her hand before they entered, a reminder of that first public declaration. As autumn deepened into winter, Vivian's classroom became the heart of the community. She organized a Christmas pageant that brought together families from across the region. On the night of the performance, the schoolhouse was packed with parents and townsfolk, all eager to see their children perform the nativity story. Yates stood at the back, watching with pride as Vivian directed the children with patient enthusiasm. When the final carol had been sung and the audience rose to applaud, he made his way to the front of the room. If I could have everyone's attention for just one more moment, he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. The room quieted, all eyes turning to the sheriff. Vivian looked at him questioningly as he approached her, something in his expression making her heart race. Miss Dubois came to our town as a stranger, he began, his voice strong despite the emotion visible in his eyes. She faced judgment and suspicion, yet she persevered with grace and determination. She's transformed our school and touched the lives of our children. He turned to face her fully now, taking both her hands in his. She's also transformed my life in ways I never imagined possible. A collective murmur ran through the crowd as Yates Mitchell, the formidable sheriff of Copper Ridge, dropped to one knee before her. Vivian Dubois, he said, his voice softening to a tone few had ever heard from him, I've come to love you more than I thought possible. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? From his pocket, he withdrew a simple gold band with a small emerald that caught the lamplight. Tears filled Vivian's eyes as she looked down at this man who had championed her, believed in her, and loved her when it seemed the world had turned its back. Yes, she whispered, then louder so all could hear. Yes, Yates Mitchell, I will marry you. The schoolhouse erupted in cheers and applause as Yates rose to his feet and slipped the ring onto her finger, before gathering her into his arms for a kiss that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. The wedding took place on a crisp spring day in April of 1877, with wildflowers carpeting the hills around Copper Ridge. The entire town turned out for the ceremony, held in the church where Yates had first publicly declared his respect for her with that kiss on her hand. Vivian wore a gown of ivory satin that Mrs. Hayes and the ladies' auxiliary had helped her create, with lace from her mother's wedding dress incorporated into the collar and cuffs. Yates, usually seen only in his practical sheriff's attire, wore a new black suit that made him look both distinguished and slightly uncomfortable. Mayor Thompson performed the ceremony, his usual gruff manner softened for the occasion. When the time came for the couple to speak their vows, Yates took Vivian's hands in his voice steady and sure. I, Yates Mitchell, take you, Vivian Dubois, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to stand by your side in all things, to honor and protect you, to face whatever trials may come together, and to love you all the days of my life. Vivian's voice trembled slightly with emotion as she responded. I, Vivian Dubois, take you, Yates Mitchell, to be my husband. I promise to be your partner and equal in all things, to support you in times of trouble, to celebrate with you in times of joy, and to love you with my whole heart for as long as I live. When Mayor Thompson pronounced them husband and wife, Yates didn't simply kiss his bride, he took her hand, and with a smile that referenced their beginning, pressed his lips to her knuckles before drawing her into a proper embrace that had the congregation both cheering and dabbing at their eyes. The celebration afterward was the grandest Copper Ridge had ever seen, with tables set up along the main street for a communal feast. Musicians played while couples danced under the open sky, and children darted between the adults, their laughter adding to the festive atmosphere. As evening fell and lanterns were lit along the street, Yates led Vivian away from the celebration toward their new home, a house he had been quietly building at the edge of town, larger than his cabin and designed with both of them in mind, including a study where Vivian could prepare her lessons and continue her correspondence with educational societies back east. On the porch, he paused, looking down at his wife with wonder still evident in his eyes. Happy, Mrs. Mitchell? Very much so, Sheriff Mitchell, she replied, her smile radiant in the gathering dusk. He swept her into his arms then, carrying her across the threshold as tradition demanded. Inside, he set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her. When you stepped off that stage all those months ago, I never imagined we'd end up here, he said, his voice husky with emotion. Nor did I, she admitted, reaching up to touch his face. I came seeking justice and found love instead. You found both, he corrected, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. And I found the other half of my soul, their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. Vivian continued teaching, her reputation growing until educators from as far away as Denver came to observe her methods. Yates remained sheriff, his fair-handed justice making Copper Ridge increasingly peaceful as the years passed. In the spring of 1878, their first child was born, a daughter they named Eleanor, after Vivian's mother. 2 years later came a son, James, who inherited his father's determined spirit and his mother's quick mind. The whispers that had once followed Vivian through town transformed into expressions of respect and admiration. The women who had once judged her harshly became her dearest friends, particularly Mrs. Hayes, who doted on the Mitchell children as if they were her own grandchildren. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Vivian with a gift, the deed to a plot of land adjacent to the schoolhouse. What's this for? She asked, examining the document. Your dream, he replied, his smile warm with pride. Land for a proper school building, not just for the children of Copper Ridge, but a boarding school that can serve families from the surrounding territories. Tears filled her eyes as she realized what this meant. The academy we've talked about, you think it's possible? I think there's nothing you can't accomplish, Vivian Mitchell, he gathered her close. The town council has already approved the plans. Construction begins next month. The Copper Ridge Academy opened its doors in September of 1883, with Vivian as its headmistress and a staff of 4 teachers recruited from back east. The 2-story building boasted modern classrooms, a library filled with books donated by supporters across the country, and dormitory rooms for students from outlying ranches and neighboring communities. By the time their 3rd child, another daughter named Sarah, arrived in 1884, Yates and Vivian had established themselves as pillars of the community. Their home was a gathering place for town celebrations, political discussions, and the occasional strategy session when Yates needed help with a particularly challenging case. One summer evening in 1890, as they sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard, Vivian leaned her head against her husband's shoulder. Do you ever think about how differently our lives might have turned out? she asked softly. Yates took her hand, his thumb brushing over the wedding band he had placed there 13 years earlier. Sometimes, if you hadn't been brave enough to come west, if I hadn't been stubborn enough to stand by you when the town was against you. If you hadn't kissed my hand in church, she added with a smile. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. Best decision I ever made, scandalized half the town and won the heart of the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Eleanor, now 12 and showing signs of her mother's scholarly inclinations, called to them from the garden where she was helping her younger siblings collect fireflies in glass jars. "Papa, come see. James caught the biggest one yet." Yates rose, pulling Vivian gently to her feet beside him. "Duty calls, Mrs. Mitchell." "Indeed it does, Sheriff." She squeezed his hand. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." As they joined their children in the twilight, the whispers that had once shadowed Vivian's arrival in Copper Ridge were long forgotten. In their place was the living legacy of a love that had defied convention, a love that had transformed not only two lives, but an entire community. Years later, when travelers passed through Copper Ridge, they would hear the story of the Eastern Lady and the frontier sheriff, how the women of the town had whispered her name like a sin, and how the lawman had kissed her hand in public, changing both their destinies forever.